The barometer fell before anyone admitted it. At the cyclone warning center in Bhubaneswar, a blue line on a monitor sank gently and then, all at once, like a swallowed breath. Outside, the heat had a taste of metal. Crows scissored the sky and argued with wires that had begun to hum with a song only anxious cities understand. A forecaster named Aditi shut the office window against air that smelled of salt, despite being 30 kilometers inland, and said the thing she'd been holding in her throat. Eyewall replacement cycle, slowing but intensifying again as it approaches shallow shelf. Surge potential is worse than yesterday. Her finger traced a track, edged in red. It walked toward the Odisha coastline, then wobbled, a child's path made serious by numbers. Wind fields broadening, central pressure sinking through the 940s, a right front quadrant fat with water. The name given by a list months ago, Montha, scrolled across the bottom of the MD bulletins, as if it had always belonged to this latitude and hour. In Kendripera district, the sarpanch of a low-lying panchayat, Lata, held a microphone to her mouth and let the village PA crackle into the afternoon. Shelter keys at the school. Buses will come in 1 hour. Pack water, medicines, documents. Tie boats together inside the creek. Lock if you must, but leave fast. She had said this before 4 smaller storms, rehearsals that ended with rain and stories. This time, her voice shook only once, when she added, "Surge may be 4-5 meters in the worst creeks. Do not wait." On a sandspit near Paradip, Ragov and his brother pulled their trawler against the mangrove fringe and lashed it to the gnarled knees of trees, older than their grandfather's memory. Ducks flurried. The mangroves were scarred from past cuts. New green had grown into old wounds. 2 ropes, Rogov said. 3, his brother answered, and wound another line as if rope were a prayer you make with your hands. Above them, the sky had turned the gray of a belly, heavy and quiet, the kind of sky that makes people talk less. Buses with red banners lettered evacuation service rolled out of a depot in Kutak, with their horns already tired. Drivers eyed the fuel gauge, counted sideways glances from police. On the highway to Puri, a line of ambulances carried children on oxygen, toward a hospital inland that promised to be above the surge line, and behind walls that had seen more weddings than wins. A mother's fingers danced attendance at a baby's nose tube. The vehicle smelled like rubbing alcohol in a fear that knew how to make space for itself. At the State Disaster Management Control Room, a wall of screens displayed a coastline mapped in urgent colors. A voice you could listen to all day if your life depended on it. Because it did read the latest from the India Meteorological Department. Extremely severe cyclonic storm Montha, now centered at 18.7 N, 87.9 Emovin, NNW, at 10 kilometers per hour. Maximum sustained winds 175 kilometers per hour, gusting 200. Landfall, window narrowing to pre-dawn. Storm surge forecast 3 to 6 meters in low-lying areas. Between Chanbali and Damra, higher in tidal creeks. Red alert, Odisha coast. North Andhra, South Bengal. Someone marked tide at landfall in large letters and circled, rising. Inspector Malik of the National Disaster Response Force checked his Team S boats with the intimacy of a mechanic and a father. Rubber inflated to firm, engines coughed, then purred. The packs that read medical were unzipped and rezipped by hands that counted by touch. In a corner, a pile of aluminium stretchers shimmered like fish. He pictured the maps he knew by bone, the embankments that would hold if luck and maintenance had been faithful, the breaches that would occur where the paddy field clay had cracked under summer suns, the lanes that would turn into canals by midnight. "We move before dawn," he told his deputy. "But if calls start earlier, we don't pretend to sleep." At the Kalinga Institute campus, now repurposed as a logistics hub, volunteers tied tarpaulins like surgeons, tie sutures. ASHA health workers sorted ores, sachets and vaccines into cold boxers, lined with gel packs that would fight a long battle against tropical physics. A man with a megaphone practiced saying in both Odia and Bengali that pets would be allowed in the school shelter and that men would have to respect the women as corners. He practiced it because it mattered. Sita folded a sari with a tenderness that made folding look like a kind of apology to a house she was leaving. Her daughter, Anya, stuffed school books into a plastic bag, then pulled them back out because the bag would be needed for rice. The television above the cupboard showed the cyclonic spiral like a mythic eye, the anchor's voice too calm to be believed. Sita's mother, whose knees hurt in rain, opened a tin that held land papers and a photograph of her husband taken when he was young and grinning, and the river behind him was clean and quick. In Calcutta far to the north, yet already feeling the breath of the thing, tide readings along the Hooghly climbed at the wrong time of day. The Sundarbans, that web of channels and mangroves that has always learned the language of water faster than men, made its own plans. Crabs burrowed deeper. A tiger watched a chital herd and did not move. Even predators wait for wind. Phones clanged to the dissonant language of mass alert. The district collector's command came in both text and human voice. Evacuate zones A through D. Embankment guardians report at post fisherfolk. Last call. A video shot by someone on the pier showed the sea making low, unfriendly shoulders under a sky filmed with white. In the market, a rumor said the river gate would be closed, then said it would be opened, then said it had been stolen. Rumors grow best under a cloud deck. The first spits of rain came sideways. Branches started to mutter. On national television, IMDS Director General appeared in a knot of microphones and held up a hand like a man stopping traffic. We've seen this track before. A slow mover near landfall with a large wind field, he said. The danger is not wind alone. It is the surge in creeks and rivers. Your life is more important than property. We can rebuild houses. We cannot rebuild people. Follow evacuation orders. Last mile warning is active. Past evening prayers. The shelters filled. Plastic chairs invented audiences, then gave up and became benches. A volunteer drew chalk lines for sleeping zones on a classroom floor and translated the signage into 3 languages and then into pointing, which is universal. An old man refused to leave his goat until a child promised to lead it in. The goat obeyed. The child. Everyone smiled in a way that softened a face and then returned to the business of worrying. The port of Paradip lit its cranes for the last load shift before shutdown. Cranes swung slowly, like giant cattle in sleep. A pilot boat bucked the early fists of the sea. The steel groaned in a tongue the engineers understood and pretended not to hear. In a village by a creek that held the brown memory of decades, Lata locked the last door she could responsibly lock and turned to go. A woman caught her sleeve. If the water comes, who will open the sluice? Say, ask it. Lata looked toward the low concrete lip at the edge of the embankment and saw no man in a cap. No boy with a rope. We will, she said, and hoped that when the time came, the mechanism would not demand a strength she did not have. After midnight, the winds stopped pretending to be a mood and became a character. Palm fronds scythed. The sound of the sea moved inland and filled rooms. A DT watched the radar paint the eyewall's ragged jaw and felt the precise, useless anger of someone who knows exactly what is coming and cannot stand in front of it. The bulletin that would be the last before landfall printed and curled out of the machine. Extremely severe cyclonic storm Montha, becoming very near the coast. Landfall likely between Mahipura and Chandrabali in next 6 to 9 hours. Surge, estimate 4-6 meters in tidal, creeks locally higher. Extremely heavy rainfall expected. Gale winds, 1701, 90 km/h, gusting to 210 km/h. Complete suspension of fishing, total shutdown of port and airport. People are advised to remain indoors in a safe room after evacuation. Sita looked at her mother's face in the flicker of failing current. Anya's hand found hers without asking. The lights went out with a shrug that felt personal, and the wind at the window rearranged the night with a kind of busy indifference that made breathing loud. Somewhere close a door banged as if someone had left in a hurry and promised to be back, and then there was only the accelerated drum of rain and a sound like someone drawing a long, sharp breath through their teeth that did not end. The first gusts felt like a warning, then turned into an argument no one could win. Tin roofs flattened and flapped. Film posters ripped and became flags of some new country called wind. Along the highway outside the evacuation convoy crawled under a rain that hurt. A bus driver peered through an arc cleared by a single working wiper and watched the taillights ahead smear themselves into a red ribbon. An ambulance inched past on the shoulder. Inside, a nurse cupped a child's face and said his name like a charm. The embankment at Karangia, bone of the village's luck, took the first surge with the gracelessness of anything asked to endure more than its design. The water that topped it was brown and muscular and carried unfamiliar belongings. A woven cot, a blue plastic drum, the ghost of a chicken coop. Lata and two men in yellow slickers leaned into the sluice wheel. It stuck. It always did in humidity. She wiped the rim with her sleeve as if tidiness could persuade iron. The wheel moved. A gate shifted. The creek swallowed with a clunk. For a minute, the water's fury had a channel. At Peradeb, cranes froze in their last positions. Lights cut to reduce hazards, and the ships lay in a tight choreography against tugboat lines. Eventide, they heaved and shouldered the pier. A pilot looked at the anemometer stuck at 180 and said, softly, to no one, enough. In the Bhubaneswar control room, screens blinked to black, then back as the UPS kicked. Aditi watched the radar sweep stutter, recover, print a wall of purple sheet he have to translate into language that wouldn't he terrify over radio. Her colleague toggled to the storm track model that took sea surface temperatures and turned them into menace and tapped the screen with the back of his pen. Slowing, he said. If it stalls near landfall, we've got long duration winds. Long search. Longer, Ryan. She nodded and made her voice a metronome. All districts, be advised. Landfall window widening. Forward speed reduced. Expect prolonged onshore flow, particularly into est. Surge warnings remain at maximum. Half the city lost power. Half of what was left lost nerve. Generators started and then coughed. In a private hospital uptown, an ICU nurse swapped an extension cord between two competing machines and hated both choices. An orderly ran a small portable oxygen concentrator down 3 flights of stairs and into an ambulance whose battery still had charge. Rain carried away his curses. NDRF teams in olive drab and life jackets moved into lanes already ankle-deep, knee-deep, hip-deep. Malk's boat kissed the corner of a house and bounced into a courtyard where a neem tree beat itself to pieces. "Hello, NDRF," he called, and a window opened like an eye. A woman pushed a baby into hands she had never met. "My father," she said, and pointed to a room where water had turned furniture into islands. 3 men made a chain and lifted an old body with the respect given to saints and corpses. Braided? They cheered like children and lied to him gaily about how fine the night was. On the evacuation road south, a jam formed at a bridge where a truck lay sideways because something far away had decided that a gust here would be a good place to land. Police pushed cars by hand, and a man in a saffron scarf directed traffic with gestures that would have been comical any other day. A cow wandered into the debris, looked at the river, and decided wisely to leave. In the bus, a baby laughed because someone had decided to clap. Someone else started a hymn. The rain beat rhythm. WhatsApp spun its tally of ghosts. A voice message claimed the dam had been opened and screamed for flight. Another voice begged to stop sharing lies. Aditi's team countered with maps and plain words and asked radio jockeys to read them over. Bollywood music, like cricket scores. They did, and people listened, and some of them let go of the door handles they had been white-knuckling for an hour. In the hills inland, later to be a zone of recovery, trees leaned together and tried to remember winters. The wind asked them to dance anyway. In Kudak, a billboard dedicated to a soft drink discovered that it could turn into a kite. It lifted and then behaved like a blade until a tree took it in both arms and held it. Sita and Anya sat on the schoolroom floor with 20 dozen others and learned the feeling of sound entering your ribs from outside and living there. A crack ran across the ceiling like a thought. The volunteer who had been a tailor yesterday and a logistics officer today walked the aisle, handing out bees, telling jokes that had only an outline but landed anyway because he was trying. A goat bleated. The child who had led it in petted its ears as if they were made of porcelain. In the Sundarbans, tide met river met wind, an earthen dike that had been patched after Yaz remembered where it had failed before and found the memory useful. It split and slid and let the wild in. Saline water took Paddy and made it something else. A woman climbed a mango tree with her son on her back without knowing she could climb, as if climbing were a verb for others. Mangroves, blessedly, looked at the water with their wide, elegant toes and refused to move. A line of fishermen on a pier in Damra made the last mistake of their day. They debated leaving one more motorboat in the open because tying it in the creek had seemed like surrender. A gust picked the boat and made the argument for them, lifting it, slamming it against its own arrogance. They ran, finally, toward the school, and the last man turned to look at the boat the way men look at the things that gave them their names, and then ran faster. Phone towers inched toward the limit of their battery backups. The network bar on the corner of the screen became a lowly dot. In the darkness that replaced signal, voices carried in a different band. Across rooms, over water, thin across the reach between roofs. By Airy Gigi. Take this rope. Don't jump. I'm coming. The rain intervened. Judge and jury. The surge in the creek near Lata. As Village found the side lane that runs slightly downhill and is proud of how quickly it drains after monsoon downpours. It used that lane as a road map. It knocked aside buckets and took a shoe and made the low wall of a courtyard into a suggestion rather than a fact. Lata, on the embankment, clutched the radio that had just lost the weather and gained the thin voices of teams who were counting their luck. Gate to open, she said into nobody's mouth. Gate 3 jammed. We need a crowbar. We need a taller crowbar. A man pressed a length of rebar into her hand as if he had heard her via thought. At the CWC, the eye moved. Not inland yet, but close enough to taste roofs. Right front quadrant over open water, Aditi said. And the room understood that the worst winds and surge would line up with the mouths of creeks, like teeth closing. Okay, someone said to no one, and everyone, okay, someone else repeated. And this is how you keep a room from breaking. You set a tempo, and in the first low wall of the school shelter breathed in, breathed out, and pushed a spray of water across the doorway, as if the building itself had sighed. Seal the lower shutters, the tailor soldier said. Put mats against the doors. The lights flickered, found themselves, and then left again, taking with them the easy kind of courage. The storm had hours yet before landfall, and already there were roofs and trees and lanes and rivers, and beneath it all the slow patient work of water finding a way into places it had no right to go, or every right, depending on whose law you respected. Sita looked at Anya's face and saw, in the lightning, the beautiful stubbornness of a look that said, whatever comes, I will not be an accident. The Iowa arrived with the inexorable courtesy of a train that keeps its timetable in thunder. 1 minute there were gusts, tantrums. The next, there was a roar with texture, like sand in a jet of steam. The school building shook in a way that seemed philosophical at first. I am a building. I oscillate, and then personal. Windows bowed in their frames. A barrage of sheet metal frisbees scythed down the lane and carved signatures into walls. Somewhere close, a tower fell, and the earth spoke in a low register. At Paradib, cranes locked to avoid the death of swinging. Even locked, their long necks wrote runes in the rain. A container yard learned the folly of order and tried chaos for a while. A stack broke free and converted itself into a sequence problem for future men in yellow helmets who would, tomorrow, mutter the poetry of forklifts and straps. The port siren screamed until the generator coughed and gave that job back to the wind. On the Bodrak plain, a line of palms that had survived 2 cyclones and a dozen harvests broke in unison, like a choir deciding to stop. A truck sat upright in 2 feet of water and turned its headlamps into weak moons. Inside, a man held his baby over his head and promised, out loud, that if the water took the truck, he would float the baby on the spare tire. The baby slept, demonstrating a wise contempt for vows. Malika's boat nosed along a lane that was not a lane, and tapped a door to announce itself, because Knuckles would make no impression against that sound. The door swung inward, and a television the size of a cupboard slid past and bumped the boat and went on its own voyage out, into a field that had become part of the river. 4, a woman said, holding up fingers to count those inside. 5, said a child behind her, revealing himself with dignity. 5, Malik agreed, updating his math, and angled his bow to a window that would serve as a door to a life raft. In the control room, the Doppler radar image became abstract art, a crescent of crimson wrapped around a void. The ite's leading edge painted with a brush called reflectivity. That meant this time not rain alone, but the spin of debris roofs and leaves, and the thin shrapnel that wind makes when it is hungry. Aditi put her finger on a cluster moving toward a creak like a piston in a lung. This, she said, and sent a message in the old ways. Phoned a landline to handheld to mouth. Move. Water's coming in towards 6 via the back channel. In the Sundarbans, a breach widened into a wound. The dike slid, the clay turned to gel, and water took what it had always wanted. The straight line into the village. People climbed onto the ridge spines of thatched roofs, and then into trees. And those who had always mocked the worship of trees felt the odd pride of being held by something older than their argument. A man held a gas cylinder like a lover, then let it go because it was heavy with the wrong promise, and would make a bomb if kept. The river argument moved inland. Kutuk, this old city, knew this debate. Shape, and argued back with the intelligence of alleys and drains. But the volume of water had the last word. The ring road went under with a reluctant shrug. A flyover became the loneliest bridge in the world. High, empty, and no place to be. Inside the school shelter, the roof became a drum. The chalk lines that had defined families smeared into a fog of feet and mats. A rank of volunteers pressed their backs against a door that had decided to become a sail. Ropes! The tailor shouted, and someone produced cords that had been used last summer to hang wet clothes and today would prevent 100 people from migrating into the wind in a single, unhelpful motion. A mother gave birth behind a chalkboard screen held by 4 women. A 5th held the newborn to her chest, with hands that had washed the bodies of her own sons in river water after fishing, and now washed this child in a lonelier water scooped from a bucket and warmed by breath. The eye crossed over the creek near Lada's village at 4 in the morning. The wind died as if someone had taken one hand off the throat of the world. Frogs spoke up rudely, delighted at the acoustics. Men peeked out of storm shutters on a reflex older than their reason. Lata walked onto the embankment and saw, under an unholy, hurt sky, a village exhaling. We can go, someone said behind her. Not yet, she said to the air, to the sea, to the weak legerdemain of the eye. Not yet. Ragov, who'd chained his boat to the mangroves, and then obeyed Lotta and brought his family to the school, looked across the field and saw the familiar angles of his thatch in a language that meant still there. A dangerous happiness tugged at him the way a friend might pull you toward a drink. He stood. Anya's hand found his sleeve, a tether that had learned a name. Baba, she said, and the vowel stretched into a rope. At a hospital that had become a lighthouse of sorts, the generator blinked, then caught. An ICU nurse grinned, which is to say she permitted the muscles around her mouth to relax enough to remember they had other uses. A doctor, hair flattened by humidity, signed his name on a chart with a pen that had refused to write until this minute, and would not be coaxed later. Water crept across the lobby, civilized as a cat. In the port, a barge slipped its moorings with the malice of a dream and began to move not toward the open sea, but along the inside of the embankment, a silent, heavy animal studying the herd. The men on the pier watched it with a comprehension that had no solutions in its pocket. If it hits the embankment, someone said, not finishing because the mine refuses to write its own obituary. Malik's radio hissed, asked for tugs, got a silence, asked the Navy, got static, asked the gods, got rain. The second eye wall announced itself, like the return of a drunk relative. The wind swung back in from the opposite quarter. The trees that had bent one way bent the other with audible complaint. The roof drumbeat resumed in a different time signature. Sita closed her eyes and saw, vividly, a plate of rice and fish at home. The ordinary grammar of dinner. She opened them on the inside of a room where everyone's breath pooled at the ceiling and made its own weather. Hold, someone said, and no one asked whom they were commanding. The daylight climbed behind a gauze of rain and revealed that the town had been rearranged by a conceptual artist with a budget and a sense of humor. Boats on lanes. Lanes and ponds. Ponds and houses. In the temple courtyard, A bell lay on its side, like a sleeping animal. Too heavy to wake. A cow ate banana leaves that had wrapped offerings, and did not apologize. The embankment at Gate 3, where Lata had asked for a taller crowbar and been given a reef of determination instead, wheezed. The sluice door stuck half. Water jabbed at the gap with fat fingers and laughed a short laugh that sounded like a cough. If the door failed, the village would be a bowl. She took the rebar, braced it, and felt something in her shoulder go from one kind of truth to another. The wheel turned a quarter more. The door ground down. The cough of the water changed tone, insulted and thwarted. At least here, at least for now, the story found its pause. The eye had passed. Everyone who had said, out loud, never again in the years since 1999, since 2013, since 2019, knew they were only in the middle of the sentence. The wind took another breath, and the second half of the night stood up. If there is a part of a cyclone that remembers your name, it is the back eye wall. It knows the layout of your village from the first pass, and returns to tell you what it thinks of your rearrangement. It arrived with the tide bearing up under it, and the surge rose the last cruel meter that takes a refusal and makes it a swim. In the river drags near Bhubaneswar, water pushed into warehouses and pulled out with it bales of jute, bags of rice. The lightest memories. The shelter school's roof tried to leave. Tin sheets flapped and then lifted, testing nails that had been pounded in with a care adequate for monsoon. Not for this. Volunteers in a line hung on 2 ropes looped over rafters with the focus of rock climbers and the manners of farmers. The rope burned palms. Someone laughed. A sharp bark that allowed everyone else to laugh too for 2 blessed seconds. A boy began to recite multiplication tables at volume 4. No reason except that somewhere in his mind numbers were a fort. In the command room, the map of calls had outgrown the room's patience. Pins walked offshore where voices said, boat seen drifting towards South Embankment. Pins sat on the ring road where a bus carried dialysis patients and now carried water ankle deep inside its aisle. We need a clearance for a Navy sortie, an officer said into a phone that wished it was a radio. Winds are above safe, came back. They will come when air allows. Tides are peaking. Prioritize last mile by local boats. Malik stood on the low step of the school and watched 2 men carry a wooden dinghy over their heads like a beetle. They looked at him and lifted their eyebrows, asking, not asking. He nodded, put his shoulder under the bow, and the 3 of them walked into the street until the water took it and their feet left the ground and they were afloat in a place where a bicycle had leaned yesterday. Temper first, one of the men said. There are 6 on the roof. 1 is a woman who can't climb down. Malik nodded again and pushed. Across the marsh, the barge advanced like a slow nightmare. It brushed a pile and the pile gave way. A crane arm shrieked in protest. A winch screamed into wind. A pilot in a slicker and a life jacket ran along a pier with the intent of a man going to ask a tiger to change its mind. Tug! He shouted at a craft that had been tied down and told to behave. A crew with faces tied in cloth leapt awkwardly onto the tug and made the engine wake with fury and love. In wind like this, the tug ran like a dog in high grass, shoulders exposed and proud, and still small. In the Sundarbans, people woke up to the fact that waking up was a gift. Salt water lapped at sleeping platforms and left rings of crystal that would tomorrow be metaphors and speeches about resilience. A fisherman tied his boat to a live branch and waited 20 seconds, and tied another rope to another branch, because old men on verandas had taught him the mathematics of redundancy, and survival is, after all, an equation. The city inland lost trees with the randomness that drives future arguments about pruning strategies. Pebas bowed elegantly and fell. Neem snapped. Gulmahar painted the road with its strange, cheerful carnage. The main road into the medical college blocked at 4 places. A junior doctor picked up a chainsaw for the first time in his life and learned, quickly, to keep the blade away from his thigh. He cut because an ambulance honked on the other side, and inside it a woman near term breathed in 4s and out in 6s like a yoga class, turned into a map. Aditi checked the tide tables again, as if they could be bribed. High tide flirted with the hour the surge was fullest, and somewhere down each creek that meant an arithmetic that emptied houses. Flash flood warning downstream parsed as surge. She sent, choosing the words for the ears that would hear them. Stay on roofs. Don't attempt to walk through water. It is stronger than you. Inside the shelter, Anya counted heartbeats, discovered that hers could be counted at all in this noise, and then counted again because counting had become a virtue. Sita watched a volunteer mop a square floor for the third time in 10 minutes and fall behind the waters. Logic. And keep going, because sometimes the job is not to win, but to insist. An old woman told a story about the 1968 cyclone in a voice that had the thinness of age, and the strength of bones forged on rice and fish, and arguments in courtyards. The tug arrived at the barge tipped like a terrier, bit with a steel line, and pulled. The line snapped, and went past a man's ear with a sound like a god cracking a whip. He fell and bounced up in the same motion. A decision, not a reflex. Another line. Another bite. Another bite. The tug's engine found a second, roaring vowel. The barge turned not much, then a little more. 10 meters sat between the barge's heavy shoulder and the embankment that held back the sea from a housing block where mothers were nursing and pretending the wind was a lullaby. 10 meters became 9. Behind the port, in a low block being used as a storage room, oxygen cylinders stood in rows like soldiers. A junior technician looked at the rising water and the calendar of patients that would want breath tomorrow and weighed. Cylinders could be moved now by 2 men, and which would require for... He took a marker and wrote on the shoulders of the heavy ones. Later, he would hate himself for it for a week, and then forgive because physics is not policy. At the sluice gate 3, the wheel spun against resistance that felt personal. Lotta's shoulder ached in a way that would be called a tear tomorrow. A man with hands like root systems leaned his weight into the rebar and said, "Without romance, we are not losing today." The gate slid, lower, then lower. Water slapped and soaked, diverted away from the houses behind them, toward a field that would drown crops and save lives. A compromise written in brown. Inland. The air began, incrementally, to change. Rain kept its ferocity. Wind, a little less. An orchard that had been vertical found its own geometry. Trees at angles, now that would make future photographs that tourists would call picturesque and families would call unlucky. The eye was gone. The engine was running out of fuel, not in the petrol sense, but in the thermodynamic. A DT watched the loops and said, in a tone that was not a promise and not a prayer, "This is the pivot." In this cola prayer broke out that had no god attached. A murmured hum of gratitude and bargaining that rose from 12 corners at once. The roof, rope, burned another set of hands. A volunteer swapped places with a boy and discovered he had less strength than he had believed, and that the other kind of strength, the one you used to admit that, would have to do. At the pier, the barge slid stubbornly toward the embankment, like a bad thought. The tug found one more knot of power and leaned a line-eld. The barge's head turned a degree, then 2. 8 meters. Became 9, 10, 12. Wind snarled as if cheated. The tug skipper cried for a second because some seconds ask for tears and nothing else. The barge slid along, grudgingly, toward a clearer channel. And then, because every story needs breath, the wind stepped down another rung of its angry ladder. The rain maintained, loyal to its own contract. The surge, at apex, began a long, slow redraft downward that tides do without apology. The back eye wall kept its deal with the sea and marched on, taking its choreography north and east. The wrong quiet replaced the right roar, and everyone in the school heard their own breath for the first time in hours, and did not trust it. Morning arrived like a confession. The city exhaled and inhaled and rediscovered small noises. The slop of water dropping from a leaf, the slap of a flip-flop across a puddle, the creak of a door unwarping itself with heat. The rain eased to a diligent patter. The wind converted from adversary to weather. The surge retreated with a thief's unconvincing innocence, leaving behind a line of salt on every wall it had touched, a watermark of memory. Moloch's team walked where last night? They had floated. The boat slid across wet mud on the shoulders of 4 men, as if it were ashamed of having needed so many hands. Check houses from the back lanes. "Look for those who couldn't shout," he said. In one, an old woman sat on a charpoy that had shifted 2 meters and stopped against a cupboard. She blinked at faces and said, "Tea," and everyone laughed a kind laugh, and then asked for water instead because tea required miracles that would take a day. Sita opened the school door with her shoulder and stepped into a lane, painting itself with sunlight and filth. A neighbor called her name like a song. "Home?" she asked. "Standing," the neighbor said. And that word did not mean dry or fine or whole, but it meant not gone. And that is a kind of miracle you can wrap in 2 syllables. They walked together toward a house that smelled of fish and prayers, and now, aggressively, of river. Inside, the bed was damp up to the pillow. The steel plates had a line of salt at their lips. The photo of her husband had curled and held its smile. At the control room, the numbers began to assemble like late guests at a wedding. Hectares of crop lost, kilometers of road cut, power poles leaning like fatigued men. The casualty list remained, for the hour, smaller than the old men had predicted, and smaller than the nightmare demanded. Early evacuation saved lives, the collector said, without triumph, with gratitude that sounded like a coin placed quietly at the foot of an altar. "We'll verify," added he said, "because that is her job." In the Sundarbans, the relief was complicated. The embankment breach had turned prawn ponds into brine, and paddy into mosaic, and the soil would stay in the soil like a bitter memory for months. But families on roofs had come down and waved from the brown lacework of their villages, and that counted. Boats delivered chlorine tablets with the ceremony of holy water. A nurse taught the use of oars again, like a catechism. At Paradep, crews counted cranes, and discovered that counting done after a night like this is a form of forgiveness. The barge sat sulking in a quieter channel, dignity wounded and useful. Tea, tug. As skipper smoked a cigarette, he had no business smoking, and let the smoke write the first draft of a story he would tell tonight with his hands. 2 meters, he'd say, and they'd picture it, and he would make it 3, because that is how stories work when they are about fear. It has to be spendable. The lessons began to arrange themselves with the inevitability of rain gutters guiding water. First, the ones that felt like praise because they were. The sirens and the last-mile mics. The school doors unlocked by someone who had the key at 2 a.m. The buses that moved on a schedule written in gusts. The NDRF timing, the tide and entering at the line between bravado and caution. The IMD, calling a track that wobbled and then firmed. The state's habit of drills that had not felt like theater in years. The death toll, kept low, not by luck alone, slid across the bottom of a television screen, and people cried anyway because numbers masked the singular. Then, the harder ones. Embankments patched to the old height when sea levels and storms have learned new tricks. Houses light enough to fly and still built on floodplains, because land is a cruel accountant. Lines overhead that snap in winds we now see more often. The exposed substations that drown and sully drinking water. Ward clinics with generators that think 2 hours is enough. WhatsApp groups that move fear faster than corrections can follow. The rain of the new century is heavier. The water runs off faster. The surge rides higher. Climate has shifted the baselines and turned a 1 in 50 into a 1 in, not every year, but in the months that matter. The farmer in the low field scraped the salt crust with a stick and stared at the bold earth. He knew the officials would come with packets of paddy and a speech. He knew the bank would call his son. He also knew the pond at the edge of his field held a net folded into a future, and that women had already begun to wash walls with sweet water-like tenderness practiced at scale. Mangrove saplings stood in rows at a nursery run by a women's self-help group down the road. They would plant them in a line that would be called a pilot project in a report, and a prayer in practice. The city engineer sketched a culvert whose mouth is higher than the surge, a power line that ducks underground at least in the densest wards, a shelter with roofs tied to rafters, with steel instead of council. An elected official read the list and thought about budgets shaped like thin quilts, and the habit of cutting corners on corners. A child in the shelter drew, with a borrowed pencil, a picture of a house with a fat roof line and a tree with both arms and a river that stayed behind a gray line that did not break. He labeled the tree Mangreb. Work began with machetes and shovels. Chainsaws bit into logs lying across lanes. Women assembled in a line with pots to carry boilable water from a tanker that wheezed at the effort of being a heart. Power crews raised poles and tied wires with gloves made to remember you can be killed by haste, by assumptions you should have retired last year. The first evening after the storm, In a school courtyard, a group shared puffed rice thrown with gagari, and found sweetness obnoxious and necessary. An epidemiologist who had worked these coasts since the 1999 supercyclone scanned lists for cholera, for leptospirosis, for the silent epidemics of despair, and asked that mental health teams be attached to relief. Trauma has a mouth, she said, and a man with a notebook wrote that down like a quote he would put near the end of his article, and then circled it for himself. Aditi walked outside and let the drizzle write polka dots across her glasses instead of wiping them. She had slept not at all, and her tiredness had the calm of the eye over land. She thought about sea surface temperatures she had been tracking for years. The winter that hadn't been winter, the odd, unnerving habit of storms to intensify rapidly near land in the new era. "We're getting better," she said to the man beside her, "and they're getting worse." He nodded. "So," he said simply, "we keep getting better." In Lotus Village, the sluice gate that had become a character in the story sat quiet and cooperative. She put her palm on the wheel and said the thank you out loud because sometimes metal hears you. Around her, women scrubbed floors with watery cow dung, as their mothers had, sealing cracks against insects and salt. A boy dragged a plastic chair out into the sun and sat on it like a king. A man hammered a corrugated sheet back onto rafters with a rhythm that will be forever the sound of recovery along this coast. At sunset, the sky performed a cliché difficult to resent. Orange behind blue, a clean line of light against a cloud that had been yesterday's catastrophe and today's theater. A prayer rose from a mosque in a voice that had waited patiently beneath wind. And a bell in a temple answered, because this is a place where calls and responses are generous. People slept on mats with a particular fatigue of those who had been inventory and now were authors again. In the press conference, the next morning, the chief minister read numbers that meant budgets, and tonnage, and kilometers and homes. And then he said the only sentence that landed, more alive, this time, than before. Fewer dead. He promised embankments, reimagined, mangroves replanted, shelters reinforced, fisheries rebuilt, lines undergrounded where it makes sense, and maintained where it does not. A reporter asked about climate, and the word adaptation arrived without disguise. What remains, in the weeks after, is the quiet heroism that never makes the footage. A teacher going door to door to coax one last family out. An engineer who refuses to sign off on a substandard repair. A hydrologist redrawing floodplain maps and arguing with men whose memories have been made obsolete by the sea. A girl who will study meteorology because a woman on television made a storm into a story. A fisherman who ties 2 ropes, next time as his first rope, not his second. When the first fair weather morning came, the beach was a palimpsest. Timber, rope, shoes, a doll with sand in the hinges of its eyes. The tide pulled at the scraps with proprietary arrogance. People walked the high line and picked what could be used. A child threw back into the sea a bottle it had spat up, scolding it for littering. Laughter happened without anyone deciding on it. Cyclone Montha passed into the north, shedding rain on states that would call it a storm and not a catastrophe. Here, the work of recovery would be the documentary's long tail. Tarpaulin. Today. Tin roof next month, a wall reinforced before next season. A map annotated for the day after that. For once, in this corner of the Bay of Bengal, the numbers would honor the drills, the trust, the lessons learned in the hard language of wind and water. The chaos would leave a ledger, and in it would be entries, not just of loss, but of skill. If stories like this move you, subscribe for more true events that change the world.